Welcome to NightCAP. It's November 30th.
Time for your weekly dose of commentary, analysis, and politics. I'm Fallon Gallagher.
And I'm James Duran.
And tonight we are joined by Sahil, who's back at the round table, and we are also joined by Kimberly Rum, a NightCAP first-timer. Thanks for joining us. So we've talked a lot on the show in recent weeks about the shifts in American politics that we've been seeing recently. Now we can put a name to it: tribalism. Politicians are sticking to others who share their exact ideology, leaving no room for bipartisanship and fractures within the parties. This tribalism we're seeing can actually explain a great deal of what's wrong with Washington politics. Arizona Senator Jeff Flake put it nicely in a tweet this week, saying, quote, "After what we know, for Republicans to support Roy Moore over Doug Jones is political tribalism at its worst. We shouldn't succumb to it." Like Flake said, we're seeing it with regards to a flood of sexual assault allegations. Last show, we talked a lot about the Roy Moore allegations. Since then, we've seen new allegations against Democrats, including Senator Al Franken and Congressman John Conyers. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi had a chance to discuss these issues on Meet the Press this week, but her comments entirely missed the mark. When Chuck Todd asked about Conyers, she replied, "We are strengthened by due process," and then called the congressman an icon in our country. These comments highlight a complete double standard in my book. James?
No, I totally agree. And, Nancy Pelosi today, Thursday, finally calling for Congressman Conyers to resign. This after the congressman checked into a hospital in Detroit after flying home in the middle of a session week. But that for me, the calls today by her and others ring hollow after her performance on Meet the Press. And I want to dive into some language that she used. There's been a lot of talk about what you mentioned, Fallon, calling him an icon. I actually don't think that was the real problem, although there is an argument to be made there that's sort of doubling down on the power dynamic.
But you think somebody that sexually harasses shouldn't be called an icon?
No, certainly. I'm saying it was a poor choice of words, but I think that's not where the focus should lie. So I think we dive into this interview. So Chuck Todd asks her, "You said there's now a zero tolerance. There's now zero tolerance." Nancy Pelosi says, "Yes." Chuck Todd responds, "John Conyers, what does that mean for him?" She responds, "Just because someone is accused, and was it one accusation? Is it two?" That's one tactic she used. Two, "I don't know who they are. Do you?" she asks. "They have not really come forward." That's another. Later in the interview, for good measure, referred to Roy Moore, who you just mentioned. She refers to him as a child molester. No alleged, no reported, just a child molester.
But she's not a journalist. She doesn't have to be as careful with alleged, reported.
The point being,
she's a
Fallon,
politician.
The point being, Fallon, apparently we only believe accusers these days if they're not a member of our party. If the accused, rather, is not a member of our party, if they're not a member of our tribe, so to speak. And I think this interview was really sort of a telling moment. I mean, Kimberly, what's your reaction to this? Not just the interview, but sort of the shifting stance of Leader Pelosi and the Democrats in general from Sunday to today on this issue?
Well, first I thought that a pretty tense moment of the interview was when Chuck Todd brought up Bill Clinton and her reaction back when she was, I believe, on Meet the Press, and her comments in regards to, at the time, the allegations surrounding Bill Clinton. And she immediately jumped to his defense, explaining that you can't equate the two, and that he was, the president at the time. These were impeachment charges. So that in and of itself is perhaps suggesting a different standard, whether it be towards her own party, whether it be, trying to, then she was jumping into a comparison of, I think she had mentioned Al Franken at one point, saying
Sure.
You can't equate Al Franken to, Bill Clinton, to Conyers. And so it's interesting trying to distinguish the different, when something should be equated, when something shouldn't be equated.
Right. And Sahil, I think it is important. There are differences, right? There are differences in a lot of these accusations. There are different degrees, but that's not actually the argument that she was making. Instead, she was trying to discredit the accusers, whom I think she, in my opinion, incredulously claimed that she didn't know the details. I mean, I think it's her job to know the details of a member of her caucus, is it not?
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think you guys put it pretty well. It was pretty convenient for her to be able to kind of back down from it and just say, "Oh yeah, I'm not really sure about that," whereas when the Roy Moore thing came up, she was much more specific about it and much more direct about it. So,
And she jumped right on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I would say I think you guys pretty much hit the nail on the head with it.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. And, it's not just Leader Pelosi. As much as I like to pick on her, we also had Jim Clyburn saying in response to reporters pointing out that folks like Matt Lauer, Harvey Weinstein even, immediately kicked out of their jobs, or fairly immediately. To which Jim Clyburn, longtime stalwart of the Congressional Black Caucus, asked who elected them, sort of suggesting that because Matt Lauer wasn't elected by voters, that Matt Lauer should actually be held to a higher standard than someone who earns the public trust. I mean, what did you think about those comments? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of tone deafness coming from Congress in general on this issue.
I think that's really ironic that if anything, I think it should be the absolute reverse, that you're electing someone to an incredibly high position in office and you should be holding them to that double standard, not the reverse. And I think just the mere fact that we're suggesting that politicians should be held to a different standard as other human beings, whether it be a comedian, someone, just a everyday person, I think is a big issue.
Well, and I think the only place where we are seeing people held to a standard is in the media, specifically in the news, in Hollywood. That's where we're seeing this actual zero tolerance that Nancy Pelosi was saying back in that interview on Meet the Press, that she supposedly had this zero tolerance. We're not seeing this with these elected officials. We're only seeing this in the private sector.
Yeah, and Sahil, I think one thing we've talked about is that neither party has really been able to take the lead on this. I mean, I would have thought going into this week that Democrats were at least going to hold on to the sort of the mantelpiece of this issue in terms of being the leaders on this issue. But it seems like we're seeing that neither can find their way, which way is up on an issue as black and white as sexual harassment. I mean, these are the folks that we entrust with issues of all kinds. I mean, is it just, I mean, how disappointing is it that these are the people we've elected essentially, and that they can't figure it out for themselves?
It's quite disappointing. I'd say not only disappointing, I'd say it's worrying. I think one of the things that we've kind of danced around but haven't explicitly said is the fact that Clyburn himself is an elected representative. And he's saying this about maybe another elected representative, but what does that mean about what he thinks about himself, and what does that mean about what the other members of Congress think about themselves? So I think, yes, it's disappointing. I think there's been a lot of disappointing things we've seen in politics over the past few months, but I also think it's worrying. I mean, who knows what's going to happen going forward if this is the way they view themselves.
Well, and I think that's the point. Sorry to interrupt, Fallon. I think that's the point, is that you don't know what's going to happen next week. I mean, it could be a member of your party next week. It could be a member of the other party next week. But when you start having different standards based on political party of the accused, then when something happens next week to your party, you have no moral authority. And so
okay, I gotta cut you off here. I'm gonna start a timer soon with you in these rants, but I want to talk a little bit more. We were talking about those elected officials, and they're there because they're supposed to be governing. And so, I want to get into this idea about governance a little bit more. I mean, I think that this is another place, like sexual harassment, where tribalism is at the heart of it. And we saw it this week with this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau leadership dilemma with Mulvaney and English. And The Atlantic was out with a great piece about this week, and the headline on that was "The Fight Over the CFPB Reveals the Broken State of American Politics." And I think that this piece is really getting it right. They're saying that this fight, this silly, arguably, allegedly silly fight, is really a proxy war for the larger issues that both of these political parties are facing, and I want to dig a little bit more into this.
Yeah, so Kimberly, when you read that piece, the David Grant piece about the history of this agency, it was essentially created to be insulated from future scrutiny by Republicans. I mean, that's quite a stunning thing. But personally, that offends me a little bit as a constitutional guy. But what they're worried about is not actually what happened here. What happened here was a resignation which was fulfilled under the Vacancies Act by the White House. Was that an appropriate, sort of stunt that Leandra English and Richard Cordray pulled? I mean, now that the court has sort of dismissed her claim, I mean, what do you make of all this? It's sort of a mess.
Well, I couldn't agree more that it's really just a metaphor for the broken state of our government. And it is really sad when you have to insulate an office to protect itself essentially from government. And I think that it was a stunt. I think that it's comical but also sad. And with the recent court ruling, I think that we'll see if there's more court rulings to come. But I really do think that it's just painting a grim picture of what our government looks like today.
Yeah, I mean, Sahil, certainly we can all have disagreements about the importance of this board, whether this board should even exist, but at the end of the day, it's not serving anyone to have two people claiming to be acting director at the same time. I mean,
especially when one of them, Mulvaney, has mocked the institution in the past.
Well, sure, but that's sort of what happens when you get elected as president. You get to appoint folks to certain jobs, regardless if they're based on your ideology. Essentially, I'm just curious, Sahil. This board, I mean, what did you make of all this? I mean, do you think that essentially there's a case to be made that this is sort of, that Democrats can't let this slip, that this is something that they need to guard against if Mick Mulvaney is going to gut out the agency, or is that sort of, are they kind of overstating that concern?
I I think they're overstating it, and I'll tell you why. I think they're overstating it because, yes, Mulvaney might have said what he said, but there are two things. One, like we're seeing with a million other things these days, there's always a political motive behind what they're saying. So I think if anything, all of these politicians are losing a bit of credibility when they're coming out in the news and saying that. Two, he might have been speaking poorly about it, but maybe he's got better ideas for it. Yes, we haven't heard him say it yet, but I mean, I think as time goes on, we can give the man a chance, see what he has to say, see what he has to do with the agency.
Yeah, of course, just an interim appointment. They still have to, confirm a permanent replacement in Congress. So
right. I'd like to keep talking about this, but I want to make sure that we get time to talk a little bit more about that gridlock that we were talking about, because I think that's one of the biggest products of this political tribalism that we've seen. This lack of governance is really translating into a lack of political and policy successes. We saw this summer. Healthcare was the big one, and Dems admitted that Obamacare was broken but wouldn't fix it. The GOP was trying to pass a bill that they admitted was a bad bill. And, now it's almost December and there's still no progress. We've seen it with tax reform. We've been talking about tax reform for weeks now. The motion to proceed just was strictly along party lines with some doubt among Republicans. We're really not seeing any progress.
no, definitely not. And I think it's embarrassing personally, both for zero Democrats to be voting for a bill that on the whole reduces taxes. I think it's embarrassing for Republicans to be putting forward bills that many of them are behind closed doors trashing. I mean, there's just no reaching across the aisle. There's no, John McCain, who talks about sort of the normal process. We're just not seeing that, and it's really unfortunate, I think.
Yeah, well, that's all the time we have for right now. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll have more NightCAP. We're going to take a look at what's coming up for the rest of 2017.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
Congress is headed to recess soon. After today, there are only 11 session days left in the Senate and 9 in the House, but both chambers have a lengthy to-do list. So I want to get into that. Before they go, we have to get into the Senate tax reform bill. They have to find a permanent fix for DACA. There's this government funding deal, chip renewal, flood insurance, FISA reauthorization, reimposing Iran sanctions, and the Spire Comstock bill, which would institute mandatory sexual harassment changing. That is a lot.
Yeah, so Kimberly, there's just no way they can get all this done, right? I mean, that's remarkable.
I've heard that no one has booked any flights for Christmas vacation yet, so.
It's probably smart. Sahil, when we were talking about taxes in particular, I mean, that's such a thorny issue, and you and I were talking about offline. They are probably still talking about this bill. They're probably still hashing out this bill because we saw them try to attach Obamacare to it, something as if you could make this harder to pass. They wanted to just give themselves that extra challenge. I
just don't understand why they would do that, because we saw that took all summer and still no progress.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if this is also a bit of a political move on their part, because, I mean, look, the Republicans right now are scrambling. They're scrambling to get something done. This year has been marked just overarchingly by a failure to pass any major legislation, and they're trying very, very hard to get some done before heading into 2018 and before heading to these midterm elections. When I saw that they were trying to attach healthcare and immigration things to this tax reform bill, at first I thought it was bizarre. It makes zero sense, but at the same time, I mean, who knows? Maybe they're just trying to delay this even further. They don't owe it to the Republicans. They do, I think, owe it to the American people to get some things done and for progress to be made. But I mean, I don't know. It just seems so out there that I can't think of another reason why this would happen.
Right, and going off of that, this really seems to be a critical time to be working together, and the president continues to fight Democrats. We saw this in the Washington Post earlier yesterday, I think it was, and they captured it perfectly with the headline saying that Trump's and Democrats trade insults to start a tense month of negotiations on year-end priorities. So all of this with a potential government shutdown looming ahead, it just doesn't seem very intelligent.
No, and of course that deadline for the government funding is only a week after tomorrow, and next Friday they have to strike a deal on that. And really, when I look at this, the biggest problem I think is just a total lack of strategy out of the White House. I mean, back in September, President Trump saddled himself with that tentative deal on DACA with Chuck and Nancy, which did him no favors with Republicans, right? There's a lot of talk behind the scenes about, should he be having these meetings with Chuck and Nancy? Why weren't Paul Ryan and Speaker Ryan and Leader McConnell there? And then with government funding expiring a week from tomorrow, he decides to burn the bridge to Chuck and Nancy too. So if you're counting at home, that's 0 bridges left. I'm dumbfounded, really.
But going back, I know both of you guys read that Washington Post article too. What are your initial reactions to that? Kimberly, what do you think?
Well, I think with this most recent stunt with, I think, Trump tweeting ahead of time in the meeting that he was supposed to have with Chuck and Nancy, and like you said, I mean, what incentive would you have to burn your remaining bridges with two people who you did have fair success with in the past on striking a deal with? And so that baffles me. I mean, we've discussed the lofty list of items on the agenda that needs to be completed before Christmas recess, and I mean, he's just not getting off to a good start.
I also think that it's interesting timing on Chuck and Nancy's part to decide to cancel this meeting now with, what did we say, 9 or 11 sessions left in Congress before the end of the year. So, I mean, there's nothing new about Trump lashing out at people, about tweeting things at people and saying these things, and people get mad at it, obviously, rightfully so. But for them to choose right now to kind of cancel this meeting, it just, I don't know, I'm a little
So it
confused
seems
by
like,
that time.
one thing that we've been hearing a lot about is as a result of sort of the lack of strategy by the White House, as a result, Democrats in Congress have all the leverage, right? And so I think what you're saying on it is that they could have taken the high road on this and almost come out even better than they already are.
Right,
I mean,
I feel like, what does that say
Right.
about them? Are they stooping down to Trump's level? I mean, can we even just blame this on Trump and his shenanigans anymore?
Right, and I think while they don't, they have certainly all the power in the scenario, and they can walk out of a meeting like that with no political penalty. It would be really nice to see someone take the higher ground. It would be nice to see someone step up to the plate and say, we have 6 session days to pass government funding. Perhaps we should just show up to the meeting, even though Trump tweeted, what did he even tweet? I can't keep
It was
track
like
of those.
Chuck and Nancy, no deal can be reached, which I don't know. I mean, it's just the same old noise
Right.
that we get every time I get a tweet notification from him. But
Gotta turn those off.
no, I'm never going to turn those off because I'd miss all these good things like the Chuck and Nancy tweets. But I want to get back to that to-do list because there were so many things there. I mean, James, I think you had a couple scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, I think so if you look at that list again, I mean, it really is striking, right? So if we game out a few scenarios, Kimberly, I think it's reasonable to say that despite that the optics of the empty chairs and all the insults, I think it is probably fair to say that they might figure out funding, if nothing else. So if we look at that list and they just get funding done, right, and maybe tax reform, let's say it passes the Senate, it's still in conference committee when they go home for Christmas recess. I mean, how do you score the year overall if we've got almost tax reform and we kept the government running?
That's 2 checks out of my 8. What's the math on
the
that?
sad thing is
1
keeping
out
the
of 4,
government
25.
running isn't a given, so I guess if you can check that off the list, that's one thing. But I mean, it just speaks to, what Trump wanted to make himself known for, which was this man who could, this deal maker who would be able to pass bills. And at the end of the day, if really him keeping the government running is the only check to his list, I mean, what does that say about, what he is, how he has presented himself?
Yeah, and I think, Sahil, they will say if tax reform is in conference committee, they will say that passed, right? If it passes the Senate, that's going to be considered a win, no doubt, given the short list of things they have to choose from.
It's not a lose.
But that's
It's not a loss, to be
that is
fair.
not certainly not a loss. But that conference committee is not nothing, right? There are so many details. We were talking about this before. So many details to this issue. Huge implications for the economy. I mean, that conference committee could span the entire month of January. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but it is no given that they can immediately reconcile the 2 bills, is it?
Absolutely not. I mean, there are definitely some key differences between the bills. There's
That's an understatement. Key differences?
Yeah, a couple of key differences, yes. I mean, so I think that even though it might get through here, once it goes to the conference committee, there's going to be a lot of reconciliation that needs to be done, regardless of how long it takes to get it done. I mean, it might be presented to the media and to the country as a win, but I mean, it's just one step in a long step towards actually getting anything done right now.
And if that's a win, so if we're counting that as a win, how do you grade the Trump administration's 2017? first year in office. It should have been easy. It should have been a honeymoon phase. How would you grade it?
Well,
If I can just push back, it was never going to be a honeymoon, but go ahead.
Okay, but in theory, you have
No.
You
It was
have a
never gonna be a
Republican.
honeymoon for
Okay,
him.
maybe not with Trump, but in theory, let's look at the political theory of this. You have a Republican in the White House. You have a Republican-controlled Senate and a Republican-controlled House. They
totally.
should really be getting things done. This should have been an easy year for them. They should have been coming in with their biggest
you're right,
electoral victory in history, whatever he was calling it as. It should have been a honeymoon
Quick
phase.
grade, 2017, if it's just taxes and government funding?
So we're not counting all the other things that
Correct.
they haven't
Yeah,
done.
Correct.
if we can get 2 out of these 8, what grade do you give him? What's he going to get on his final exam?
Tweets get extra points.
Oh, well, if
Bonus
tweets get extra
points.
point, we're looking at an A+ right now.
Yeah.
Or an A+++++.
Yeah, no, I
over
would- I
100%.
definitely
Best
wouldn't.
GPA at Northwestern.
I definitely wouldn't give them a high grade by any means. I mean, considering, like you said, they walked in here having everything they could have asked for, and we've spent the entire year dealing with tweets and distractions. So we clearly, I mean, we're looking at they're down to a week and a half to try and be like, oh wait, there was this long list of things we needed to get done. I think people were less than impressed by his first 100 days, even though he sent out a few tweets talking about how great it was, and that was
The
best
greatest
ever.
100 days
Yeah.
in the history of 100
Of course,
days.
I mean it was in the Twitter, so it must have been true, right? But
That's fact.
yeah.
That's not an alternative fact. That is a fact.
So yeah, I mean, no, I think that they came in with a relatively good situation in terms of the ability to get things done, and they've wasted a year now just dealing with.
Well, Fallon, you know, we focus a lot on the end of this session, right, or the first part of this session.
Right.
But frankly, if you think about another date, January 30th, State of the Union, that's arguably a more important date for this White House, right, to have things to put in that speech.
Yeah, if you don't have content there. Although I will say, to be fair, when he gave his speech to the joint session of Congress back in the spring, it wasn't horrible. So,
Oh,
you know,
highlight for
right.
so far.
So if you know, I would give him a challenge. If he can pull off a State of the Union that in some way resembles that speech with some of these successes, I mean, we can extend this. Maybe if he can get some of these things done by January 30th, his grade can go up just a little bit.
I think that's fair.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this topic. If you are enjoying the conversation, you can follow along on social media or chime in if you have something that you want to add. Stick with us for more NightCAP right after the break.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Go you Northwestern. Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
And we were just talking about the tweets. President Trump continues his war against the so-called enemy of the people. That's us. You're in that now that you host this show. Tweeting this weekend that CNN International is a poor representation of the U.S., which I'm pretty sure is his job as president. But he also proposed a fake news contest excluding his favorite Fox, which only talks about our favorite president.
Real news.
With high stakes. There's a trophy on the line for this so-called contest. I hope we can get in on that.
Probably a bottle of Trump Meritage, but I want to talk about some other tweets quickly. You're not going to hear me defending the comments, certainly about CNN International. I think those are very dangerous comments, but one thing I do want to talk about that I saw this week that I think needs to be talked about are sort of the reasonable concerns that people like me, that conservatives have about media bias. So the New York Times opinion page this week, tweeting like a Democratic political organization, posting the phone numbers of key Republican senators ahead of the tax bill vote. We got this, this explanation that the New York Times editorial board taking over that Twitter, as well as doing it for folks like Bob Corker, Jeff Flake, John McCain, really up and down the list of key votes.
Susan Collins.
Susan Collins as well. So, Kimberly, I know this Twitter, as they said, is run by the editorial board. They made that very clear, and certainly an editorial board has free reign over the sort of opinions that they want to have, but this seems to be more political advocacy than journalism, even more so than opinion-based journalism. Am I wrong? Am I overstating this, or is this something new?
I don't think you're necessarily overstating it, and I do think this is something new, especially to the past few years. We maybe come a few years ago, I don't think we would have been seeing something like this. And granted, it is the editorial section, and just in and of itself, it flags. You're going to be seeing some more bias, but I do think there's a fine line, and whether or not that line was crossed, I don't know if I necessarily feel it was crossed, but I do think that it is a dangerous thing to be having that so blatantly stated.
I will say, as a journalist, it did seem a little bit odd to me that it was coming from the New York Times. I mean, when you ask people if they read a newspaper, the first one they're going to say is the New York Times. The second one's probably the Washington Post. It's very well known across the country, and I will agree. I think it did overstep the line of editorial a little bit. I think if we had seen this from a publication like Breitbart, we wouldn't be surprised by it. I think the really shocking part of this whole thing was that it was the New York Times. I mean, to bring it back to campus, I mean, like, what if the Daily Northwestern started doing that? I think that we would all find that a little bit bizarre.
Yeah, and Sahil, one thing that I wanted to point out, and one thing you might share this view, when President Trump tweets about the fake news media, about CNN International, which by all accounts does a very good job and is an important institution, does that criticism sort of crowd out the real and true sort of criticisms that folks like me have about, whether it's the New York Times, whether it's the Huffington Post or BuzzFeed or Fox, whatever it may be? Does that make it harder to sort of weigh actual criticisms of media bias when he does that?
I absolutely think that, because, I mean, every time a conversation about media bias comes up now, what's the first thing people are going to talk about? It's these tweets. It's when it's the first words.
And how dangerous they are.
Yeah, A, how dangerous they are, and B, I mean, even the phrase fake news has become a running joke. You see it all the time in popular culture. Everyone's like, oh, fake news this, ha ha. But I mean, I think it's dangerous, and I think it's kind of, what's the word? It's I can't think of the word, but
well, it overshadows the
it's
true
counterproductive.
Yes, exactly.
It's counterproductive for what he's trying to do, and yeah.
Okay, well, I want to jump to our favorite topic or segment before we run out of time. In case you guys missed it, what did you guys miss this week? Our roundtable is going to let you know. So let's start with Kimberly. What did we miss?
Well, just about 4 hours ago, we're hearing another shakeup potentially in the White House with Rex Tillerson maybe on the outs and looking to replace the Secretary of State perhaps with the CIA director. So.
Do you think it's real this time? Because last time when Rex called Trump a moron, we heard talk of that again and it didn't happen.
You never know with Trump, but they, I think, just had a briefing in the White House on it, so I think we'll know more soon.
All right, Sahil, what do you got for us this week?
For those interested in healthcare, I think there's been a pretty big shakeup coming up. I don't know if it's just still in the works, or if maybe they recently announced that it's happening, is CVS trying to acquire Aetna Insurance. So that'll be interesting in terms of customers' insurance and the entire healthcare landscape. I think it's a pretty massive, tens of billions of dollars of a transaction. So
it'd be interesting to see if the White House fights that merger as much as they fought CNN and, Time Warner and AT&T.
Absolutely.
So I, talked about Nancy Pelosi a lot, gave her a hard time, which I think probably deserves.
Which you do. You do that a lot.
But I want to highlight Congresswoman Kathleen Rice, Congresswoman from New York, a Democrat, who's been one of the few voices of reason on both sides this week. Frankly, from the beginning, we got November 22nd. That's 2 days after the first allegations against Congressman Conyers. Congresswoman Rice calling for him to resign. Only now, more than a week later, do we have other folks joining her in that camp. This is someone who has voiced support in the past for Tim Ryan, for replacing Leader Pelosi. It really is amazing what you can do when you're not beholden to party leadership. I think that's the takeaway for me.
Okay, well, I want to get mine in this week because this one's actually really important. We talked a lot last week about the Washington Post reporting on Roy Moore. If you haven't heard, Project Veritas tried to send a fake accuser to the Washington Post, and if you haven't seen the video of the Washington Post journalist talking to this fake accuser, you should really watch it because it really shows how just airtight that original report was. But unfortunately, that is all the time we have for you tonight. We are going on recess just like Congress is, but we will be back in January. Enjoy your night. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys.